everybody. My name is Randall Halle. I am the director of the European Studies Center, Jean Monnet EU Center of Excellence at the University of Pittsburgh. And I am delighted to actually be hosting this conversation on the 20th anniversary of EU enlargement. The discussions in this series parallel also our typical conversations on Europe series, and we're taking this opportunity of 20 years on to actually investigate, explore with colleagues the experience and the ramifications of European accession. This is a monthly series, and in January, I have to check, January 25th, the next conversation will be with colleagues around Slovenia. And I encourage you all to register and sign up for that one. The series is a webinar, and we welcome your questions, and I encourage you to use the Q&A and at any time, and I will be happy to incorporate your questions. My colleagues here will be able to see the questions, and we'll be able to bring them into the conversation. It is going to be an open conversation. And what we typically do is I will introduce the participants and give each of them an opportunity to say some opening remarks, and then we'll enter into an open conversation in which your feedback input is welcome. So indeed, this conversation is on the Baltics in general, but we have two experts in the region, but also on Latvia in particular. And I'm very excited to welcome both of you. Our first guest this month is Daunis Auers, who is also a professor and Jean Monnet chair at the University of Latvia. I didn't check, but actually at this moment, I believe you are you still in Washington and Seattle, at the University of Washington in Seattle? So we're not quite in the same time zone, but a little bit closer here. Daunis is a professor of European Studies. He studied at the London School of Economics and defended his PhD at the University College London, UCL. He's been a Fulbright Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley from 2005 to 2006, and a Baltic American Freedom Foundation Scholar at Wayne State in Detroit in 2014. And his book on the comparative government and politics of the Baltic States, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the 21st century was published recently by Palgrave Macmillan. And he is currently working on a monograph analyzing Nordic-Baltic integration, so larger regional integration, which is very interesting to us to also address. And as I just mentioned, he's a Fulbright visiting distinguished professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I hope that's going well. Daunis, do you have any thoughts? And part of what I was hoping also is not just your academic expertise and insights, but you're someone who also lived through many of these transformations that we're talking about. And I'm wondering if you have some opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Randall, for that kind introduction. Well, I can say that I'm already one up on my debating partner here, Ivars Ijabs, MEP, because I've actually experienced two accessions to the European Union, because as a young boy, I grew up in the United Kingdom, and I was 3 years old when the UK joined the EU in 1973. So I have to admit my memories of that are quite limited. However, in 1993, I moved to Latvia, which has been my base ever since, so for the last 30 years. And beginning from 1994, I started working for an organization called Eurofaculty, which was one of the multiple organizations, consultants, and so on, coming from primarily Western Europe, and working with processes of democratization, marketization, and what would eventually come to be known as Europeanization as well. And in our particular case, we were working with the largest national universities in the three Baltic states on their, let's say, modernization. And well, quite frankly, there was a lot to do. One of the striking things, I think, when we think back these 30 years, is the economic and, to a certain extent, the political and certainly also the social crisis that we experienced in the 1990s, and the incredible depth of the issues. For instance, if we look at institutions, in contrast to Hungary, Poland, and so on, the three Baltic states were, of course, constituent republics of the Soviet Union, which meant that they lacked many of the core institutions of a state, like a national civil service, like many ministries, a tax gathering authority, a central bank. You know, I could go on for a long time. These institutions simply didn't exist. And construction on them in many cases began before independence. Sovereign independence was achieved in August 1991, but really it only continued apace once sovereign independence was fully achieved. So after August 1991. So a whole host of institutions had to be built, had to be constructed, while at the same time, all three Baltic states experienced a very sharp economic collapse, you could say. I mean, GDP fell by about 50%, because there were no real tax gathering authorities. Only really the really big companies and public institutions paid taxes, which meant that there were very limited tax income to pay for all these public goods and so on. And it was a very challenging environment in the 1990s, where, quite frankly, there was actually quite limited assistance from Western Europe. And researching the Nordic-Baltic region, I think it's quite striking that we see that in the 20th century, the Nordics had essentially 100 years of uninterrupted economic growth. During the Second World War, they did extremely well, especially if you look at Sweden with its exports to Germany throughout this period. And then at the end of the Second World War, they all received Marshall Fund monies to reconstruct economies that didn't really need reconstructing. And the Baltic states never received anything like these kind of Marshall funds. So that's one thing that I think we should point out, that in the 1990s, the depth of the crisis was extreme. And the achievements over the last 30 years. So, for example, if we take Ireland out of the EU 27, leave it as EU 26, in the 21st century, the three Baltic states have had by far the sharpest rise in incomes, with the other countries, including the Central and East European countries, not coming anywhere close to them. I mean, the transformation has been tremendous. And I think with that, I'll end my opening words.
That's a wonderful opening, and you really raise a number of very interesting and important issues. I think the question of Europeanization versus liberalization, democratization, that there's a certain kind of framing that takes place there. This regional profile and what kind of possibilities. And it also makes me wonder, as a follow-up question that we'll get back to maybe, of how, in effect, maybe the problematic beginnings that you have are part of also the economic success of the present. So other countries that had to reform, or East Germany that could be assisted by West Germany, has a very different kind of profile today, and that's all very interesting. But for those of you who are in the audience of this conversation at the moment, I would just say I've already noted that there's a lovely competition and humor between these two participants today. And so, Ivars, Daunis has actually challenged you, and let me introduce you first. We're really fortunate to have Ivars Ijabs, who is a current member of the European Parliament, elected in 2019 from the Electoral Alliance PAR. Before entering politics, he was a widely known political scientist, publicist, associate professor, also at the University of Latvia. and a researcher in the Advanced Social and Political Research Institute there. He started his studies at Vitolis Latvian Academy of Music in the French horn class. And afterwards, he studied philosophy in Latvia and Germany, where he obtained his BA and MA. Already during his philosophy studies, he developed an interest in politics, which he later chose as a field of research for his PhD thesis. And he has participated in multiple research projects, as well as in scientific conferences in Latvia and elsewhere. And as I learned in a pre-conversation, these two gentlemen were also present in Moldova a while back to talk about accession, where they honed their collegial sparring skills. So, Ivars, then let's just, an initial question for you is, you grew up in Latvia. You're not a member of the Latvian diaspora, or is your story then on that level also similar to Daunis?
Yes, thank you very much, Randall, and thank you very much for having me. Yes, as you might guess from my accent, I'm not born in the UK like my dear colleague Daunis, but coming up back to my memories, it's, I think that all the economic problems and the creation of new institutions during the 1990s, this is really a very important point, but at the same time, to understand the EU accession as a process, we should still take into account the very special status of the Baltic countries. They were really, indeed, they were constituent parts of the Soviet Union, lacking most of the institutions of independent statehood and so on and so forth. At the same time, they were very untypical, non-typical republics of the Soviet Union. First of all, because we lost our independence in 1940, because we had this experience with independent statehood. The other fact is that in the West, we weren't recognized as constituent partners. That's why there is also a very special feeling toward the US and the Baltics, because, we know that the US administrations, all consecutive US administrations didn't recognize the incorporation of the Baltic countries in the Soviet Union, which means that for us, the main thing after the Soviet Union broke down politically was just getting back to the West. In a sense that, in all the formal documents, all the policy papers of that time, I think that it is being formulated as irreversibility of our independence, meaning that we didn't have much illusions about the Russian Federation back then. And in that sense, of course, we proved right in the last years, but at the same time, which means that it was a primary goal for the Baltic countries to get into all West-centered international organizations, meaning the two most important, of course, were the EU and NATO. But even now, I think that Daunis might correct me, but and the Baltic countries are one of the most integrated countries in the world. We are members of everything apart from probably G20 and G7, but we are, the Council of Europe, Schengen zone, of course, OECD, and also not just the EU and NATO, but all possible organizations. And for us to understand, this is really an issue of national security, because this is the irreversibility of our statehood. The process itself was very beneficial also in terms of reforming our economy and our state administration. Of course, this process was, to some extent formal and according to the principle, fake it until you make it, but we were faking in many ways those reforms in order to get in, and we succeeded. The process wasn't so smooth, actually, because there were certain different scenarios being planned in the late 1990s, but nevertheless we did it, and we know how beneficial the process itself was for our economies and for our democracies. And so that's why the Baltic countries are among the staunchest supporters of further enlargement, especially concerning Ukraine and Moldova, which are, of course, right now the most important countries which will have been given the candidate status, and hopefully the Council will decide next week that we will open negotiations with them. Although I have to say that in the EU, in general, of course, the enlargement process has been stalled because of different reasons, mainly because of, well, countries not capable of agreeing on anything. But nevertheless, I think that we should move forward. Thank you very much.
No, I appreciate that. And I think, again, you've underscored certain things that I would like to pursue for a very long time, but it's also, we're looking at needs for new kinds of democratization in the EU itself, and the conversations that are there. So it's interesting at the moment to have a member of the parliament who himself is interested in accession, further expansion, and part of that deliberative body. I wonder, though, if we could explore for a second, because NATO's now been put into the conversation, and one might say that we already made this observation about the immediate transition period of democratization, liberalization, Europeanization, and Westernization, and all of these are playing certain kinds of roles. And I would also add in my own areas is to think about cultural integration in the European Union, and how various kinds of forms of cultural integration take place, which are often neglected in these conversations. And so the Baltics are three separate countries with a very strong regional identity, as you've described. I guess, let me just formulate a question to you. Was it inevitable that Europe, that it would, Westernization and Europeanization would be the route that transpired, that was, or were there other possibilities? So not aligning with Russian Federation in the immediate post-Soviet era is something that Ivars, you just underscored. But were there other possibilities, or would one say, as Angela Merkel used to say, there was no alternative?
I'll maybe take this one first. And I think realistically, there was no alternative. Because if we look at elite cohesion in the early 1990s, and still today, the Latvian elite is more or less entirely pro-European, pro-Atlanticist, pro-Western, and has very much focused on, let's say, escaping from the clutches of the Soviet Union, and now, of course, Russia. And this is one of the few issues on which there is, as I've said, a great deal of elite cohesion. So you could look at ministerial turnover in, let's say, the health ministry, the welfare ministry, and these sort of domestic ministries. And it's been pretty high over the last 30 years. But then take a look at how many ministers of foreign affairs we've had. Very, very few. But the current president served as a minister of foreign affairs for, and Ivars will correct me if I'm wrong, I think 11 years before he was elected as president. And then the prime minister has now taken over as a foreign minister. And this is indicative of the fact that this is one of those issues which isn't really discussed at the elite level. In Latvia, we've never had a serious Eurosceptic political party. There have been some Eurosceptic individuals. There are some parties which sort of flirt with Euroscepticism, perhaps even in the parliament at the moment. But there is no real serious representation of this idea, even though in society there is a certain level of Euroscepticism. But I would say it's a sort of fuzzy Euroscepticism. And you can see this in the referendum vote on Latvia joining, which this has happened to me twice now, that I've spoken to former ministers about this. And they've been under the impression that there was a huge turning out of people, scattering flowers over prime ministers and ministers in thanks for joining the European Union. But in actual fact, the vote in support, which was, Ivars, correct me, 60-something as I recall, was one of the lowest votes in favor of joining the European Union. And there had even been some elite panic in the months running up to the vote, in that there was a very unequal distribution of money between the pro campaigns and the anti campaigns. So the government, throwing, for obvious reasons, money at the pro campaign. Now, this is not to say that there's a majority of the population. Absolutely not. A majority of the population is very much pro-European, and you can see this in Eurobarometers, where we have extremely high levels of trust in people like Ivars, in our members of the European Parliament, and in European institutions, much higher than for our domestic institutions. But so I think from this perspective, any other alternative, any kind of vision of joining the Commonwealth of Independent States or something was not seriously discussed. And this also is the story of how the Baltics got into the European Union and NATO in 2004, something which would have seemed impossible just 10 years earlier, because elite cohesion, absolute focus, having the right people in the right jobs at the right time, so the right prime ministers, the right presidents, saying the right things to the right audiences. For me at least, I think this was, from a Latvian perspective, inevitable. From a European perspective, there could have been alternatives, of course, but the Latvians, I don't think, seriously considered anything else except this. And I'm sure that Ivars will now correct me.
I'm sure, and I just want to add in, though, that it is the case, and that is also very interesting, that if we go a little bit further south, the configuration changes very much. And so in spite of countries like Poland or Hungary or Slovakia having histories that would suggest that they should not be looking further to the east, not flirting with Russia, not being EU skeptic. In many ways, they're in a very different configuration. The Visegrad states played a different role in accession, and I don't expect you to comment on it, but it is something that you're alluding to. There are different entry points here in this period, and here there seems to be regional solidarity. And I want to remind everybody here that independence in these three countries was also a kind of unified effort across the countries in some ways. The very famous moment of the hands across the capitals and the turn towards singing and these kinds of things that really suggest that there was a commonality already in the breaking away. Ivars, you have much more intelligent things to say. I don't need to be occupying.
Well, no, I just wanted to pick up on what you said, Randall, on the cultural side of that westernization, if you want. This is an extremely important point that, well, in most of the EU member states, the EU is perceived somehow differently. Because in the Baltic countries, of course, the EU was really, well, a symbol of returning to the West, of joining some larger Western-centered international structure, which would provide us with a certain degree of security. And that's why, for example, I don't think that most of them Latvians who voted in that referendum for accession, they had any clear idea of what's this all about and what the EU is. We're working here in the European Parliament, I can, well, just confirm the fact that, well, this is a very limited institution to a sense. Because, well, the EU, this is not a federation. EU is basically, well, this is about those famous four freedoms: freedom, movement of capital, movement of labor, movement of services. and movement of goods. So, and this is basically the basis of that thing. And that's why, of course, right now we have more of Euroscepticism, because people are dissatisfied of how this is working out. Like, well, we have a huge out-migration, basically because of the EU and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, there is a certain geopolitical imperative, if you want, at the basis, which means that we had to join the organization, and we had to stay into that organization and to support it, because this is, well, one of the very fundamentals of our existence. Thank you. Over.
Ivars, I want to stick with you for a second, because now we have you just spoke about outward migration, you spoke about migration in general, and I'm wondering maybe if can I put you on the spot? You grew up, you're a post-socialist subject, as it were, and so we could say that there was a moment where exile or diasporic Balts, Latvians appear, and you might remember that, but there's also this history of Russians and Russian speaking, sometimes almost not necessarily majorities, but very dominant populations there. And now we have new waves of migration, both in emigration and immigration to the region. I'm wondering if you could say something both from your role in the parliament and as a politician, but also your personal experience of those kinds of transformations in the community. Because
well, as for the Latvian and Estonian situations, these two countries are somewhat similar, because during the Soviet era, these two countries being occupied by the Soviets, they experienced quite an important inflow of Russian-speaking migrants who stayed there when the Soviet Union broke down. And well, this has been also an issue regarding our EU accession, because during that process there is this what we call conditionality. Of course, there were certain disagreements about the citizenship policies, about linguistic policies, about the role of human rights, and so on and so forth. We had to align our policies just to meet European standards on human and minority rights. But as for the Russian-speaking minorities, of course, I think that a large part of Euroscepticism, also those people who voted against in that 2003, if I'm not mistaken, referendums, these were basically those Russian speakers who already back then were living to a large extent in the media space of the Russian Federation. They were just consuming all the propaganda back then, and that's why there is a certain element of also the Russian revisionism in the Baltics. It was from the very, very beginning clear that Russian Federation, not just with Putin, but even with Yeltsin, is a revisionist power, which is basically willing to revise the existing borders and existing international settlement in Europe. And that's why, of course, it plays a role, but of course, right now, it is also having its role, especially because the Baltic countries, just like Poland and some other countries, we are the staunchest supporters of Western unity in supporting Ukraine. Thank you.
Lithuania had a very different policy vis-a-vis its Russian minorities, extending citizenship rather quickly. Latvia and Estonia created a couple stages in order to allow, in effect, Russian people to become first residents and then apply for citizenship after a certain kind of process. Daunis, can you talk a little bit about that and that dynamic as it's unfolded in Latvia and the Baltics in general?
Yeah, Lithuania, as Ivars alluded to, was fundamentally different. to Estonia and Latvia, because the largest ethnic minority in Lithuania is Poles. And Poles, I think, made up about 8% of the population in 1991, and Russian speakers were somewhere around 5%. So as a result, Russian speakers were simply much easier to absorb, much less of a challenge, and they were less concentrated. In other words, they were sort of scattered around all of Lithuania. The challenge for Estonia was that about 1/3 of the population was Russian speaking, and overwhelmingly Russian migrants who had entered during the Second World War and were not integrated into Estonian society, didn't speak Estonian language, were not integrated into the culture, and so on. And they were concentrated on two regions. One is this industrial region of Narva, which borders Ivangorod, Russia, sort of quite close to St. Petersburg, if you like, sort of a manufacturing center, and also this shale mining area, and then also around Tallinn. And in Latvia, the Russian-speaking minority was larger. In fact, in 1989, when the Soviet census was carried out, the last one, Latvians made up 52% of the population of the Republic of Latvia. And so for Latvian politicians, this was on their mind, right? The fact that Latvians were almost a minority in Latvia, and then, well, what will happen to Latvian language, Latvian culture, and so on. And so the concern in those early years was very much to ensure that Latvian culture, Latvian ideas, Latvian language would be rooted in the state. And the logical way to do this was to ensure that early governments put this into practice. And so there was a decision made, indirectly, of course, but a decision made to sort of delay the granting of citizenship over the 1990s, so that we have a certain direction of political development, marketization, capitalization, Europeanization, and so on, before, let's say, the citizenship process is opened up. And in Estonia, it happened a little bit faster, and the concerns were not as pronounced as they were in Latvia. But really, it was this demographic time bomb which was so critical in the early 1990s. And of course, just one other thing I wanted to add, and perhaps you were coming to this, Randall, but demography remains a critical issue, because if we talk about the post-2004 era, then we've seen somewhere between 200 to 300,000 Latvian citizens, Latvian residents relocate to the European Union. Of course, since then, the UK has left, and a great many people have remained in the United Kingdom, but still it's 10 to 15% of the population that have left Latvia, and that's brought in new demographic concerns for the country.
I know that I was actually, as Ivars noted, you have the four freedoms, and so the freedom of movement also means the freedom to move away and to take advantage there, and that obviously had an impact. I'm wondering, actually, though, just to pursue this for a second, you noted about the Soviet era and the need to create brand new institutions. What were the role, am I mistaken in my understanding that Russian actually was also the kind of institutional language during the Soviet period, and so the reassertion of the local languages is also a reassertion of autonomy, or how am I to understand that process, and what was the nature there of independence and as it were, taking control and creating those institutions?
Well, if I may explain this, well, they had the policy of what they call the asymmetric bilingualism during the, they didn't call it like that, but this is how we call it today, meaning that there was an imperial language, which was kind of an imperial normalcy, where everyone had to speak it. I speak fluent Russian because I was growing up back then. And but at the same time, of course, there was also a certain public recognition of the Latvian language, Latvian literature, Latvian language media, and so on and so forth, But the problem was, of course, well, this is about those post-imperial minorities. When the Soviet Union broke down, well, the Russians living in Latvia and Estonia, they didn't feel themselves as a minority. They wanted to be, if you want, the imperial normalcy. And so why don't you speak Russian? Because everyone has to speak Russian. There is this kind of, well, if you want, well, certain colonial attitude towards the region. And of course, I mean, this has been a demographic problem, and it is still very much, because you might have heard also among the political scientists, this is a topic about migration in that part of the world. Yes, on the one hand, of course, we are experiencing the migration, the outward migration of our own people at the same time, both Latvians and Russians. But, well, at the same time, of course, there is a certain influx of illegal migrants over the Russian and Belarusian borders, which creates a very particular political situation, because also our right-wing parties also, well, are following certain Western examples in having this anti-migrant, partially racist rhetoric when dealing with this issue. Thank you.
Great. Daunis, did you want to add to that in any way, or if not, that's okay.
No, I think Ivars covered it, but certainly it's true that in the 1990s, you saw a distinct movement towards strengthening the place of particular languages in the Baltic states. So Russian language was pushed out of much of the public sphere, but not in areas like, let's say, hospitals. I mean, of course, doctors would continue to communicate with their patients in the Russian language. And it's important to note that Latvia and Estonia also maintained bilingual school education systems right up until quite recently, when following the war in Ukraine, the decision was made to move towards a unified school system, which is, in my opinion, certainly the right choice to have made, because the divided school system is one of the factors which has continued to sort of divide Latvian society and civil society over the last 30 years. Because, I mean, people, you know, grow up in separate cultures, in separate schools, in separate even sporting groups, and there's very little, you know, possibility for cooperation and discussion and integration and intermingling and so on. So there was this period in the 1990s when there was support for the Latvian language and efforts made to sort of limit Russian. And then over the last 2 years, this has been accelerated once more. So, and I should say in Estonia and Latvia.
So we're talking, I mean, accession, EU enlargement, there's in effect, again, two parts to it. One is the shaping of the country to arrive at accession, the opening of the acquis and these kinds of shaping functions, and then the actual experience of being in this union. And I would like to explore that kind of dynamic. I have a very rabbit hole question that's perhaps not interesting at all. But before I pose it, I want to remind people that if you have questions, please post them in the question and answer, and we'll draw them into our conversation here. But the Baltic states were participants to, in effect, the Soviet debt. And I find it interesting to consider something about this. Daunis, you observe the kind of the decline in the economy that took place after separation, and I'm wondering if we could explore a little bit of that economic experience and what happened to the Soviet debt. How did the situation develop that, in effect, we're talking about, in spite of demographic shifts, migration, outward migration, countries that have become IT centers, and as a film scholar, 3D and experimental visual technology, you have to go to the Baltics to experience the kinds of moving images that are being produced there. And so it's a really very futuristic almost turn, leaping over into a very 21st century economy. And I'm wondering if we could explore the economic transformations that took place a little bit. And either of you, if you
I can deal with this first, and Ivars can correct me if I'm wrong. But as I recall, Russia took on the Soviet debt. And so Latvia didn't have to deal with paying for the Soviet debt. And in fact, there's been a long-lasting movement in all three Baltic states over the last 30 years, claiming that we should be getting compensation for Russia, for distortion of the economy. Because I think there's absolutely no doubt that the Soviet era rapidly distorted the development of the Baltic states. GDP and economic data on the first half of the 20th century is quite incoherent amongst various states. But there's been some research done on this over the last couple of years where you can quite clearly see that the four Baltic states, as it was in the interwar era, because of course Finland was essentially a Baltic state, then it hadn't become a Nordic state at that time, they all had very similar levels of economic development. But Latvia and Estonia were ahead of Finland, and Lithuania lagged, which had a much more agricultural economy, lagged behind quite significantly, despite the huge distortions that the Baltic states had experienced during the First World War, when manufacturing was literally packed up and shipped off to mainland Russia, never to return, when the banks, which were such a big part of the economy in Riga, leaving it to be a sort of Singapore of the early 20th century, the banks, which were primarily foreign-owned, returned to France, returned to the UK, returned to Italy, and their home bases also never to return. And so you had this disruption in the First World War, you had the disruption of the Second World War, and then you had the disruption of the Soviet era, the investment in illogical manufacturing. I mean, as we discovered in the early 1990s, nobody wanted to buy the stuff that we made. There were very few services in the Baltic states, but people weren't standing in line to buy the Latvia microbus or minibus, which was being made in Jelgava, or the telephones, which we prided ourselves on making in the old VEF factory in Riga, which looked like 1950s telephones and had 1940s technology inside them. And so this is why we had this valley of tears, as Ralph Dahrendorf described the 1990s, where you had a huge fall in economic output, huge fall in government incomes, and huge increase in social crisis, which you can see in rising suicide rates. It's been very interesting work done on health as well, where you can see that the stress of the time led to increased cardiovascular disease amongst especially working men who were very stressed by the time. And so really the reconstruction of the economy since then is absolutely amazing. And probably the most significant part of the reconstruction of that economy does go down to the European Union. It does go down to accessing the single market, so once it was clear that the Baltic states were getting in, we could see a boom in foreign direct investment, which also continued after the Baltic states joined, because this was a sort of mark that this was a safe area to invest. And then Baltic companies have actually been very, very agile at adjusting to the single market, to finding their place in various value chains, both in the services sector, both in the manufacturing sector. And that's led to these tremendous economic changes that we've seen. But although it's quite interesting that in all three Baltic states, there is a part of the population which is quite dissatisfied with the rate of economic reform. And certainly I think we could have done better, especially when you look at Latvia. But still, the fact that you have the sharpest rise in incomes in the three Baltic states in the 21st century, it indicates that something must have been done right.
Yeah.
Ivars, do you want to add to that?
Well, I think that the most important things have been said by Daunis. Of course, well, in terms of economic reform, of course, there were quite a few things that still are very much contested among economists. I mean, first of all, this is, of course, the introduction of the new currency regime and national banks, which was, I mean, a very strictly monetarist policy chosen by all the three Baltic countries, which probably wasn't helping the economy much. But nevertheless, I mean, this is still an issue for the economists, of course, also the issue of privatization, which is a huge issue everywhere. There are differences among the three Baltic countries, but on how it was done. I mean, there is certain level of corruption, of course, everywhere in such processes, but you might argue, well, whether the current economic differences among the countries can be explained also by taking into account different models and approaches to privatization. But as for the FDI, I mean, this is one of the current issues. Yes, like Daunis is absolutely right that the EU has helped very much in that, and which means that, well, this is the most beneficial environment we can imagine for the Latvian economy being in the EU. Although it's not perfect, we all know all the distortions, and myself, a member of the Single Market Committee here, I know what this is all about, but nevertheless, well, this is really a success. But of course, the current problem, of course, with FDI is, well, the security situation in the region, with Ukraine being so close in many ways to where we are. Thank you.
So this leads to now two questions on my part that are interrelated or perhaps very separate. One is about regionalism, and if we're talking about FDI, I know that in especially the 90s, the beginning of the new millennium, the major trading partner for everyone in Europe was Germany, and the strength of Germany as an influence is something that I wouldn't mind hearing from you, because if we have a region called the Baltics and we have a region called the Nordics, there is also some kind of relationship to Germany that's fundamental for everyone here. But I also wonder that in the economic transformations that we're talking about, there was a phase that the Baltic economies went through in which oligarchs played a role. And there were kinds of transformations, or maybe I'm mistaken, but I'm wondering about that period or the particular nature of privatization, the sort of question of the oligarchs, and perhaps that accession was also involved in the kinds of pressures to liberalize, to further liberalize, and maybe that's, Daunis, what you were referring to, that didn't go far enough in privatization, or maybe I'm misunderstanding something. So this question of economy and regionalism vis-a-vis the EU, vis-a-vis Germany, and that would be potentially a question that takes us into the post-accession era, but also this question of the shift in the economy and how it may have looked more like its Central Eastern European partners than in other ways, a full liberal economy. Do you have thoughts on either of those?
I'll maybe go first again very quickly, and I would say that the impact of Germany, if we're talking not about the political impact, but the economic impact of German entrepreneurs and so on, in the Baltic states is much more limited than it has been in Poland, in Hungary, in the Czech Republic, and so on. There are, in all three Baltic states, there are small manufacturing enterprises which make widgets for German cars. And this was much discussed in Lithuania last year, when China had threatened to ban imports of any goods containing Lithuanian manufactured goods. And it turned out that, many cars manufactured by and in Germany and in neighboring countries have these Lithuanian widgets. But if you look at the overall data, much bigger impact has come from the Nordic states. The Nordic states dominate the banking sector. The Nordic states, with their consultants, their advice, and also let's not forget that within the European Union, the three Baltic states cooperate with the Nordic states in the NB6, the Nordic-Baltic 6 format: Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and the three Baltic states. And I think you can see their legacy in economic terms, and we probably don't have time to touch on this, but I think you also see it very much in social terms, because this sort of legendary Nordic model, especially this welfare model, we actually have something very similar in the Baltic states. The only difference is that we don't have the same money to fuel it. But if you look at the benefits which are given to Nordic citizens, paternity benefits, maternity benefits, free healthcare, free education, and so on and so on. All these things, which there's a wonderful book about this called The Swedish Theory of Love, which talks about how this was developed over the last 250 years. Well, it's been developed in the Baltic states over the last 25 years. Essentially, all the same mechanisms exist. The difference is that we don't have the funding to provide, let's say, the same quality of housing for seniors that they do in the Nordic states. So I would focus more on the Nordic influence in shaping the Baltics, which of course is what I'm writing about at the moment as well, than the German influence. But I think maybe Ivars, sitting in the European Parliament with its 99 German MEPs, notices that influence more.
Well, as for Germany, yes. I mean, well, you might know that the biggest car producer right now in the EU per capita is Slovakia. Because all the German factories have been transferred to Slovakia, Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on and so forth. There is nothing like that in the Baltics, which is a pity, of course, because well, we would be happy to have something of that. Well, there is a certain historical nostalgia about that. But well, relations with Germany, I think well, there are quite a few German enterprises active in Latvia. They are, well, just like most foreign investors, they are worrying about the demography in that sense. As for the differing social models, well, as for the European Parliament, yes, there are certain affinities with Nordic countries. This is what I'm experiencing myself when dealing with some colleagues. Of course, right now, the Nordic countries tend to be very close partners in economic policies because everyone is being afraid of that immense amount of state aid flowing into the German and French economies. And of course, even the Nordics can't afford anything like that, not talking about the Baltics, which makes, again, that single market and for freedoms a very problematic issue for our economic future. And that's why, of course, we tend to cooperate also with those German, politicians like the German liberals, who are defending the return to normal, predictable, level playing field in terms of state aid. But this is just one of the issues. But of course, in economic terms, there is quite a good cooperation with the Nordics. In social policies, of course, this is not the case because the Nordics want to preserve their systems of healthcare, their systems of social benefits, not being forced to share their lucrative, funds with all those Eastern European countries who might not be so well off. Thank you.
That's very interesting. I want to be mindful of our time and actually take us from here to the very contemporary moment. And there's so many things that I would love to explore with you, but I am wondering about this history of the relationship with Russia and the impact of that history vis-a-vis the invasion of Ukraine. And I'm wondering what we might say the role before the invasion of Ukraine of the Baltics was, in which there was a kind of general sense of engagement with Russia, and perhaps in the Baltics a different skepticism of that relationship. And so I'm wondering if we could talk about the kind of role that the Baltics, Latvia in particular, has played in framing the EU's relationship to Russia and the response to Ukraine war. Ivars, maybe you could.
Yes, I'll be quick. Well, first of all, well, if you want it in one word, it's decoupling. Well, this is a very gradual decoupling, both economically and culturally and so on and so forth, also politically. Because, well, of course, there are quite a few cultural affinities. For example, most Latvians of my age speak fluent Russian, not talking about, let's say, the generation of my parents, who's the most widespread foreign language for that generation is, of course, Russian, which means also, though there are certain nostalgia, as you call it in Germany, and but at the same time, of course, right now what we are experiencing is decoupling, and of course, start of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That process has accelerated in many ways. Thank you.
But can I stick with you for a second about this question of decoupling? Because further to the south, decoupling is something that is only now happening, or not necessarily happening in a fully engaged way. Energy policy, for instance, made it clear that there was a very, very strong connection and engagement rather than decoupling. And am I to understand that we would describe the Baltics as having begun the process of decoupling much earlier than other states in the EU in that region, or would we say the Baltics are on par with the countries further to the south?
First of all, I think that you can regard all those 30 years basically as basically the timeline for that process. Some of the elements have taken place earlier, some of them later. Energy has, of course, been a very crucial issue because, well, Latvians, and I think that this more or less goes for all the three countries, we have been talking a lot about, well, just getting rid of that energy dependency on Gazprom, and so but very little has been done in order to really to achieve that, because cheap Russian gas was flowing not just to Germany but also to the Baltics, and right now, of course, the situation has changed significantly. But well, of course, it depends on how you define it. But if let's say even 5 years ago, if you could hear in the Latvian political elite, let's say, more moderate approaches to Russia, let's say, let's have a dialogue, let's deal with them, this kind of Wandel durch Handel approach of Germany. Right now, of course, nothing like that is even imaginable. Thank you.
Daunis, do you have any thoughts to add here? I'm sure you do.
No, I think Ivars has covered everything. I would just briefly add that the difference with Latvia and the other Baltic states, and probably other countries in the European Union, is that Russia has consistently over the last 20 years organized regular military exercises on the border, practicing invading the Baltic states. Whereas the Baltic states, ever since joining NATO 19 years ago, have been practicing, have had exercises defending their territories. And this perhaps has very much informed the way we look at Russia, that we have seen Russia as practicing an aggressive policy towards European Union member states, and that has also framed the reaction of the Baltic states and their policies towards Russia over these last 20 years.
We have no time left, but I would wonder, the news today is in effect that American aid to Ukraine is stalling, and there are dynamics in the war, and as we enter into the winter, that will probably kind of settle in for a slog until the spring again. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what happens either way, in effect, the idea from the Ukrainian perspective is if we lose, we cease to exist. If we succeed, Russia has no impact other than is moved out of the country. What might you be thinking of the support for Ukraine continuing from the Baltics? I assume in many ways that there is, here again, we're looking at a region that sees no alternative but to support Ukraine and to support a defensive policy vis-a-vis Russia, or am I mistaken?
No, I mean, absolutely. For the Baltics, it's an existential issue. Just a few days ago, Vladimir Putin made one of his usual comments, this time about Latvia, and made a very specific threat that Russia would be prepared to defend its compatriots and so on. So, I mean, for the Baltic states, really nothing has changed. We have a border with Russia. We know Russian intentions, and support for Ukraine is unlikely to flag too much in the Baltic states.
Ivars, would you like to have the last word here?
Yes, well, just briefly, of course, we have a very strong perception in the Baltic countries that Ukrainians are fighting our war. And of course, for us, this is really an imperative to keep that Western alliance together, and that's why, of course, we are observing what's happening in the U.S. But we still have certain hopes regarding the U.S. Policy towards that region, because of course, well, even with the change of administration, I don't think that any U.S. administration would be willing to screw up all the partners in Europe. But nevertheless, well, of course, here in the European Parliament, the attitude is slightly different because, of course, there is also a tendency, mainly represented by my French colleagues, that the EU should get rid of that dependency on the US. But right now it's time to act. I mean, this what happened today in Congress is just a part of the story. Let's see what's going to happen next week in the European Council, where the decision on the money from the EU is going to be decided. Thank you.
And with that, I might say, if I were able to vote for you, I probably would. That was a really well-formulated explanation. I appreciate that. Thank you to both of you, and I really appreciate this conversation. And I look forward to being in touch with you. And again, a reminder that the next conversation on EU enlargement will be focused on Slovenia on January 25th. So, all right, everybody, have a good day.